Okay, now let's talk about checkmating the enemy king, which is king and rook. Now, previously we talked about checkmating the enemy king with king and queen and king and 2 rooks. And you should practice these checkmates a number of times to where you can do them almost automatically. Okay, so now let's discuss checkmating the king with just king and rook. And in this lecture I'm going to discuss sort of what's referred to as the sort of a knight's hop method. Okay, and what we're going to do is sort of chase the enemy king. We're going to move our king into a position basically where it's like one knight hop away from the king. Okay, so what we're going to do, well, first we're going to actually move our rook and cut off the king as much as possible. So I'm going to move my rook up, and this actually sort of cuts off the enemy king. What we're going to do is drive the enemy king to the back of the board, drive him back this way, and then checkmate him. Okay, now he isn't going to follow those exact squares, but we're going to drive him to the edge of the board and then checkmate him. And how we're going to do this is with a knight's hop jump. So it's now black's move, and let's say black moves this way. Now we want to move our king to one knight's hop away, and let's just, let's say if the king square, we're going to look at where maybe a knight from where one knight's hop away would be. Okay, so these are like maybe the possible squares. And notice there's only one square possible for our king to move to this knight's hop jump. So we're going to move the enemy king here because, like I said, it's effectively like a knight's hop away. Okay, now let's say the enemy king decides to move back. Now this is the critical position. Okay, once you get this position where the enemy king now is lined up directly in front of your king, just 2 squares, okay, directly in front of, this is when you want to move your rook down and check the king. Okay, what I mean by this is you want to move your rook down just 1, and now check. Now notice that the rook sort of, can capture on any one of these green, or where I'm putting my arrow, any one of these squares, and the enemy king cannot go to any one of these squares because it's controlled by the enemy king, or the white king. So effectively the black king must go to any one of these green squares, effectively being driven back. Okay, now let's say the black king decides to go back. Now we want to chase the enemy king a knight's jump, so let's go this way. Now if the enemy king were to move this way, we would continue to, drive him back by moving the rook down and checking him just like previously. But, obviously now the enemy king is aware of this, and it's going to run. It's going to run this way. We're just going to move our king 1 knight's jump away from the king. Okay? We're just going to continue this pattern. The king's going to run. Now the king gets nowhere to go but to come back, and they get into the critical position again. Remember, it moved exactly, it's sort of right in front of our king. Now we're going to just move the rook back and check. And notice how, once again, the rook covers these squares that I'm highlighting. I should probably make them red. And then the king is going to cover these 3 red squares. And once again, the enemy king can only move to these squares. So it's being driven back. Okay, so let's say it decides to go here. Now we're just going to make, follow him 1 knight's jump. And notice that the enemy king cannot actually move to this square because the rook is keeping the king up, on this side of the board. Notice how the rook is just sort of, keeping him sort of in this box. So the king's going to keep going. Now if the king moves here, obviously the king could capture the rook, so we have to move our rook. So where do we move our rook? Well, just move it all the way over to the other side of the board. Okay? Simple. The king cannot escape to any one of these squares because the rook controls this, still controls this line. Okay? Now the enemy king will probably try to come back. Now notice, you don't want to move here like this. Okay? Thinking, oh, I'll get the critical position, but you won't, because it will be black's turn. And black will simply just go this way, and then you'll end up having to chase him sort of in this direction again, and you will have gained nothing. So when the enemy king comes back, remember the king just came from this square right here, do not move your king here. Waste the move. What I mean by waste the move is just move the rook one. Just move it over. Okay? And now notice if the enemy king moves over here, we will have the critical position where we can move the rook down and force him back. So the king will probably run now this way. You'll just follow him. You know, the one knight jump away. But now the enemy king is actually forced back to the critical position. That's when you move the rook down. So now, you know, the knight says check, and the enemy king, obviously, can I go to these two squares because of the rook? Can I go to these three squares because of the king? So once again, it's forced back. So let's say it goes here. Remember, when you move up, you want to move up to where a knight's jump away, and that would be just square right here, because effectively, if the king were a knight, you know, it would make sort of a knight's jump. So we're going to move one knight jump away. And of course, the king is not going to move this direction because we just drive it back, so it's going to run. This is how this checkmate looks. It just keeps, you know, the king keeps running like this. Now the king gets over to the rook. It's threatening to capture the rook. So we can't allow that. So we'll just move the rook all the way over. Once again, the king will probably try to come back, because if we move this way, the enemy king is just going to move this way. We will have accomplished nothing. We won't reach the critical position. So once again, just waste the move. You know, now if the enemy king moved here, we'd have the critical position, but it isn't. It isn't just interested in getting driven back, so it'll run over to the edge. Then we'll do this. Then it will come back, and we'll have the critical position. We'll just check. Now the enemy king is forced back, let's say to here. We'll follow it with one knight's jump up to here. The enemy king will keep running. I think you can see the pattern now. We don't want to lose our rook, so we'll bring it all the way over. The enemy king will probably come back. We'll waste the move. And then it doesn't want to move back. So now we'll run. We'll come back, and actually now we'll deliver checkmate, because it can't move. You know, the rook can capture on any of these squares, so the enemy king can't go here and here, and it's in check, and it can't go here and here and here, these three squares, because of the king. So this is checkmate.